everyone. Thank you to everyone who is joining us on Facebook and to those listening or watching the podcast later on. My name is Emma Goldblatt, and I'm the program manager here at Shamayim, Jewish Animal Advocacy. Today, we're so excited to have with us Dr. Andrew Kelly. For those of you who don't know, Andrew is a passionate animal advocate who has worked for multiple animal welfare organizations, including the Royal Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals, the Humane Society International. He was CEO of the Irish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals for 7 years, and is now director of Freedom for Animals, which you might also know as FFA. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. We're so excited to have you here and so grateful that you could be here to share about all that you do for the animals. With that being said, could you tell us some more about your work?
Of course. So I've been director of Freedom for Animals for just over a year now. I joined in December 2021, so just over a year. And Freedom for Animals used to be known as the Captive Animal Protection Society. We're actually one of the oldest animal rights organizations in the United Kingdom. We were founded by a retired school teacher in 1957. So we've been fighting for better protection for animals for over 65 years. And we campaign for an end to the abuse and exploitation of animals, primarily for human entertainment. So we work on things like captivity of animals in zoos, in mobile zoos, in aquariums, circuses, of course, but we also campaign for better protection for animals in bird of prey centres, and in the TV, media and film industries. And also we do a lot of work on the exotic pet trade, because it's one of the biggest problems in terms of animal welfare globally, and is just behind the international arms trading and drugs trades. Wildlife trade comes third in that league table. So it's a significant amount of animals being traded and a large sum of money. So of course there's a lot of illegal behavior involved, which then results in severe suffering of animals, high mortality, and so on. So we've been campaigning over the years for a phase out of zoos, because many people will have visited the zoo. Many of your listeners will have visited zoos over the years. And as a child, I grew up going to the zoo as well, and I always enjoyed going to the zoo. I loved seeing the animals. It was very exciting and exotic and different. But when you look a bit closer at many zoos, there's a lot of suffering goes on behind the scenes that they just don't tell us about. So just to use an example of elephants, which everybody loves elephants, they're fantastic animals, beautiful to see in the wild. And lots of people go to zoos specifically to see them. But it's been known now for several decades that elephants do not thrive in zoos. They live shorter lives than their wild counterparts on average. They have significant health problems. They will have reduced reproduction. They will have increased infant mortality. And by an infant, I mean an elephant under the age of 5 years. They'll also have significantly increased rate of stillbirths than wild elephants will have. And they'll suffer significant welfare problems like joint problems, muscle problems, feet problems, because they're in an environment where the substrate isn't conducive to good welfare. But they also show significant psychological damage in captivity. So they will show stereotypical behavior. And if you go to a zoo, you may see an elephant moving its head backwards and forwards, shaking its trunk, pacing on one leg onto the other leg, moving around in circles and so on. And that's stereotypical behavior. And it's caused by stress and boredom. And if you imagine a herd of elephants living in the wild, whether it's in Southeast Asia, the Asian elephant, or in Africa, they live in matriarchal groups. So, and they stay in those groups for life, except the young males who will eventually move on to form another group. So most of the elephants that are in zoos were taken from the wild or have been bred in captivity. And believe it or not, even to this day, they're still taking elephants from the wild to sell and transport to zoos around the world. But those elephants that have been taken from the wild and brought to zoos will lead shorter lives as a result. But we still have a large number of elephants around the world in zoos. Here in the United Kingdom, for example, there's around 50 elephants in 11 zoos. Some zoos have recognised that they can't really provide a suitable environment, so they've started to phase them out and don't replace them if and when they finally die or have to be euthanized. But most zoos have less than a couple of acres for their elephants, and the elephants they have are not related to each other, so they're being forced together into an unnatural grouping, an unnatural social group, and they're very intelligent, complex social animals that really really need to be in that matriarchal group, because that's how they evolved. And to take them from those groups and to create artificial groups is stressful in itself, and I would consider it to be a significant animal welfare problem. But to this day, elephants still persist in zoos still persist in keeping elephants. And indeed, we often see news on social media that from a zoo that their elephants have given birth, and there's a lovely picture of the calf, and everybody says, oh, how cute, and there's quite often a competition to name it, and all these kind of things, Emma, that you've seen time and time again. But the reality is that the elephants are suffering, and they shouldn't be there. We've also seen that the area that they provide, the environment that they provide for the elephants, is significantly smaller than the area they would have in the wild. For Indian elephants, it's something like 30 times smaller. For African elephants, 100 times smaller. So these are animals that are used to wandering for across huge areas, and suddenly they're limited to a small concrete block in many cases. So it's a significant animal welfare problem. Now, zoos sell themselves on being important for conservation and for education for people. I would say that that's a little bit of a myth, to be honest. The reality is that most zoos do very little for conservation. None of the animals that they breed, or very few of the animals that they breed in captivity, will ever be released to the wild. Now, there's some reasons for that, because the habitat might be lost, or there's not proper protection for them in their natural habitat or home countries. But that's where the money should be getting spent, is to protect habitats in situ, and not to create essentially museums of animals for people to gaze at. So the conservation angle is usually based around, well, we breed these animals to ensure their survival in the wild, but they don't release them to the wild. So that's simply not true. And then what they also don't tell you is that they overbreed animals, that there's a large surplus in zoos that don't have the proper genes. So they are breeding them according to a stud book run by one of the zoo organizations. And they essentially breed them to maintain the populations in other zoos. So they will breed a tiger or a lion, and they'll either keep it for their own stock, or they'll send it on to another zoo to be further bred. And we've seen time and time again that things go wrong with this. Surplus animals are killed because they are not valuable for the breeding program. Surplus animals are also neglected in many zoos, perhaps not some of the larger and better known zoos, but there are many zoos around the world that don't come up to the same standards, of course. But we've seen here, even recently in the UK, over the last few months, a number of stories that are really concerning for us. In one case, a female tiger was killed by a male tiger when the zoo introduced them to mate. And the male turned on the female and attacked her and killed her. And a similar thing happened with a lion in another zoo. But these were written off as being unusual occurrences, but the reality is they happen regularly. And indeed, the tiger that killed the female had done exactly the same thing in another zoo in Copenhagen before it was transferred to the British Zoo. So what we would like to see, over time is a transition from what we see as this sort of traditional physical zoo into a more sanctuary-based system where animals are provided with an appropriate environment, that they are essentially looked at to see whether they can be released back into the wild, if that's appropriate. Now, some animals bred in captivity probably can't be released back into the wild for various reasons. So we would like to see them living out their lives in an appropriate sanctuary, accredited sanctuary by, perhaps accredited by the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, GFAS, which is based in LA. And someplace like the Tennessee Elephant Sanctuary, for example, is a really a good sanctuary for elephants. Now, there is a shortage of these kinds of sanctuaries around, but we do think that there is an opportunity for some larger zoos to transition into that kind of sanctuary, which is more about rescuing, rehabilitation, and release of animals back into the wild. The other thing that zoos often say is, well, we're here to educate the public. Now, they might well provide education to the public, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it sinks in and that public go away having been educated. And what we do see is, and if you've ever been to a zoo, and I go sometimes sort of undercover to see what's going on, if you just sit and watch people, they'll come along, they'll look at the animals, they'll ooh and ah about them, but they won't actually read the information board. So it's not clear to me how that's educating them. Might be nice to see the animals, but of course nowadays we've got television programs, television channels even dedicated to wildlife documentaries, National Geographic, for example. We also have much broader travel now, and people can go and see wildlife in the wild. And of course, locally, you can do that too. I'm sure there's some fantastic wildlife around where you are in Arizona. Even where I am here in Ireland, there's some fantastic wildlife sites. I went round the other day there to see the geese coming in to roost in Dundalk Bay. Local wildlife is fascinating and more educational than seeing animals in cages. So we campaign for an end to that. The other thing about education, of course, is zoos have been around for 150 years in various formats. And if they are educating people about looking after the wild, they've failed because we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. And we're simply not protecting those wild areas and those wild species in situ where we should be. So from our perspective, governments and people, of course, need to be putting their resources into protecting natural habitats. That's the way to educate people, and that's the way to conserve wild animals for future generations. So that's zoos. And then, of course, you have things like mobile zoos as well, where animals are used to entertain people at birthday parties and so on. And it might seem like a really harmless, benign thing to do, but a lot of the animals involved in these are wild animals. So they may have been bred in captivity, but they're still wild animals because they retain the natural behaviors of the wild animals, and they still look like wild animals. So things like meerkats, very popular thing in mobile zoos. People like to hold them, and other things like reptiles, iguanas, all these kind of things. But what we don't do is say, well, is that what the animal wants to do? I went to one mobile zoo event recently where they were passing animals around like pass the parcel at a children's party. And I counted that 35 different people held that particular, it was an iguana in this case, but it was literally just being passed backwards and forwards. And reptiles, as you know, Emma, are really very docile animals. They don't show when they're stressed. They don't show when they're ill. And when they are finally showing that they're ill, it's quite often too late to save them because they're really seriously ill. And so what we would like to see, of course, is prohibition of using wild animals in mobile zoos, and domesticated animals to a certain extent as well, because sometimes they're not looked after as well as they should do. Now, here in the UK, there is legislation to license people who are displaying these animals at mobile zoos, but we don't believe it's sufficient to protect the welfare of the animals, and we want to see it strengthened, but ultimately we want to see an end to the use of animals in these kind of zoos. I don't know what the situation in the United States is in terms of circuses at the moment with wild animals. I have seen that some circuses have retired animals like elephants, and they are going to sanctuaries, which is fantastic to hear and see. Here in Ireland, where I'm currently sitting, there was a ban brought in the use of any wild animals in circuses in 2018. And when I was working for the Irish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, we campaigned on that issue, and we were delighted when we were successful in that campaign. England, Scotland, and Wales have also now introduced a ban, as have many countries around the world. And there will come a time when no wild animals are used in circuses, and people will think, why did we ever think that was acceptable? In 2016 here in Ireland, a circus came to Ireland with 3 Indian elephants, and they paraded them down the main street in a town in Ireland. And we watched while the handlers had their bull hooks up their sleeves to control the elephants, which they do with a hook behind the ear into the soft tissue. So they use pain to control the elephants, and it's just not acceptable in a modern progressive society. So that has to change. As I say, there's no more wild animals in UK or Ireland, and hopefully one day globally there'll be no more wild animals in circuses.
Yes.
Would you like me to carry on? There's some other topics there if you would like me to continue.
Yes, I'd love to hear about it.
Okay, so the next topic I'd like to mention is aquariums. So essentially zoos for aquatic animals. And again, many people have visited them. I remember visiting them in the past, and the colors, the lighting and all that, it's very seductive. People enjoy it. It's a very atmospheric and lovely, except people don't understand what goes on behind the scenes. And sadly, in most aquariums, mortality rates are very high. We know that in most cases, most fish species in aquariums are still taken from the wild. So around 80 to 90% of fish in aquariums are stolen from the wild, transported around the world, and kept in a tank where their lifespans will be short. And we also see stereotypic behavior in fish in aquariums. And again, people might not realize that, but you will see fish repeating the same actions time after time after time. And that's because they're in an abnormal environment, and it's causing them stress. When they are caught from the wild, there's high mortality in some of the methods used to catch them. There's high mortality in the shipping. So they're usually shipped around the world in crates, in bags of water, by air mostly. But there's a big mortality rate there. And then they go to pet shops or to aquariums. In the pet shops, again, there's high mortality. So whenever you're going to buy your dog or cat food and you stop to have a look at the fish in the tanks, it might look like they're living a good life, but the reality is the mortality rate is very high, but they're all fished out. The dead ones are all fished out and removed on a daily basis so that you don't see them. So aquariums are a problem as well. And we had in Germany recently, there was a famous aquarium, a big cylindrical aquarium outside a hotel, which exploded recently, and as a result, 10,000 fish perished. So these are animals that are being used essentially for ornaments, and lots of people may have a tank in their house with fish in them, and I'm sure they look after them as best they possibly can and provide them with as good an environment as they can. But all I would say is, look into where they came from. Were they bred in captivity? Were they taken from the wild? If they were taken from the wild, how many of their how many other fish of the same species that were caught at the same time died in transit, so that a pet shop can sell these fish. So we campaign against aquariums. We would like to see better protections for fish. We would like to see a prohibition on the taking of fish from the wild for aquariums, certainly. We would like to see bigger penalties for cruelty to fish as well as other animals. And people tend to think that that fish don't feel, that they're not sentient. But I think that's changed now. I think we know now that there's enough scientific evidence to confirm that fish can feel pain, that they like to have the company of their own species, and within that they like to have the company of specific individuals. So they're showing personalities just like you and I. They're showing choices just like you and I, and they're showing decisions based on those choices just like you and I would do. So I think we need to recognize that fish and other aquatic animals are just as sentient as our dogs and our cats and the wild animals that we've been talking about in zoos. One of the other things, again, that people don't really see as being a problem is the falconry trade. And I don't want to upset anybody who in the falconry trade, but there are some practices within it which we don't believe are acceptable. And the main one of those is tethering. And so for your listeners, tethering is where they have a bird of prey and it's tied to a perch, usually with a leather strap and jessie. And they stay on those for, in some cases, 24 hours a day. And we've seen them at zoos and other bird of prey centres where they are trying to escape, but of course they can't because they are tied to the perch. We've seen them try to prise the tether off using their beaks. We've seen them flapping about, screeching because they can't escape. And you and I will be familiar with the phrase "at the end of our tether." It means that we are frustrated because we're annoyed about something. That's where it comes from, is if you're at the end of your tether. So these birds are literally at the end of their tether. They don't want to be there. And you often see them displayed in a way that it makes them visible to the public who have paid to come and see them, but with no thought to the welfare of the birds. So you'll see large birds of prey, or maybe an eagle owl, a great horned owl, I think you call them in the US. You might see one of those next to a smaller species. And what you'll see is the other species will turn its back to that bigger bird because it's afraid. Because large birds of prey will kill small birds of prey. So they think that they're going to be predated on. Now, I'm sure people go and enjoy the displays and see the birds flying and taking bits of food. But you've also got to remember how they train them to do that. And they train them to do that by keeping them hungry, because otherwise they wouldn't do it. So birds of prey are really quite lazy. They'll go out and they'll hunt. They'll eat as much as they can, and then they'll sit about until they need to hunt again. And of course, this is known. So they'll keep them fed, but they won't feed them much in the lead up to a display. And so they're actually hungry when they go into those displays. And it's, we wouldn't do that to our dogs or our cats. We wouldn't starve them, just so they perform the trick, which is essentially what birds of prey are doing. But of course, the other thing is that birds of prey are either taken as an egg. Many of them are captive bred, but some of the breeders will take the egg and hatch it away from the mother, and then they'll they'll get the chick and they'll imprint it on themselves as the owner, and that is confusing for the bird. So it thinks it's actually a human, and some species, especially owls, will become so attached to the human that they think it's their mate. And so they will show abnormal behavior. They'll become aggressive to other people, and they'll actually try to mate with their owner. So you might see them rubbing themselves against the owner, and that's them trying to mate. So they're fooling these birds into thinking they're people. They're fooling these birds into performing tricks for the public. And again, many of those birds are suffering as a result. And we've often seen cases here in the UK where people just fail to look after them properly, and the authorities have to get involved, whether that's the RSPCA, who I used to work for, or the police or other agencies have to get involved. And we see these kind of cruelty cases far too often, and we would like to see that brought to an end. And the authorities in the UK are looking currently at the practice of tethering and whether or not it should continue, and we hope that they'll make the decision to prohibit it. But that's going to make it very difficult for many falconry centres to continue, because they know that if they can't tie their birds up to a post, they're not going to stay there. So that's just one other thing. The other thing I'd like to talk about today is the use of animals in TV, film, and media. And we all love to see animals in films, and it's fantastic. You go to the cinema and see these things, but sometimes we forget that the animals aren't necessarily treated very well in the background, Emma. And you'll often see no birds were harmed in the no animals were harmed in the making of this film. But saying that doesn't necessarily make it true. And we do hear from time to time of animals being cruelly treated, and one of the most famous ones is Harry Potter, which I'm sure many of your supporters will be aware of. It's a fantastic series of films, and a lot of owls were used in the making of that. Well, the original owner of the owls in the original films was prosecuted by the RSPCA for animal cruelty, and a large number of owls seized from them because they were failing to look after them appropriately. So even, they might not have been cruelly treated on the film set, but the industry breeding them is a problem. And we have a company based here in the UK that provides animals to the film and media industry, but we also know that they're linked to the circus industry, and they export animals to circuses around the world and so on. So there are problems with that. So what we would like to see is advertising organizations that might use animals in adverts, phase them out. Use computer graphics nowadays. You don't need to have live animals. And film as well, use computer graphics. Or even animatronics. Technology nowadays has moved on apace. We would like to see a transition to places that instead of have live animals, they use the animatronics. There are companies just set up here in the UK called Zootronic, for example, that we're working with to promote the use of animatronics instead of live animals. And this would be a place that you would go to. You would essentially be immersed into a specific habitat type. It might be the plains of Africa or the Rocky Mountains or wherever. And you'll see the animals close up, a virtual reality experience, essentially. You'll see the animals close up, but they will be computer generated and using other new technology. And I think that's the way forward. We need to move away from this idea that keeping animals in cages is a good thing, and start looking at alternatives where you can still be entertained, still be immersed in the animal experience, but no live animals are necessary in that. And just a very final word, if you don't mind, Emma, is on the exotic pet trade. Every year, literally hundreds of millions of what we call non-traditional pets or exotic pets are traded globally. Many of them are taken from the wild, legally and illegally. They're shipped all over the world, and many of them live short lives because their owners can't look after them. Things like chameleons, they're nicknamed the 6-month pet here because that's about as long as they're going to live, because people can't look after them properly. In the wild, they'll live for several years, but it's just not possible to recreate the specific environment that these animals need in a domestic environment. Believe it or not, in the UK, it's still, and I think in the US as well, it's still legal to keep monkeys as pets. Monkeys are really intelligent, complex, social animals. And we often find them kept as individuals in a parrot cage or a small cage in a house, showing completely abnormal behavior. Many people that own them might dress them up like they're dolls. They might take them out for walks on leads, and it's completely inappropriate. these animals are specialist animals. They should only be kept by people who understand their social and welfare needs, or better still, not kept at all and living free in the wild. But there's such a vast range of these exotic pets, whether it's reptiles, amphibians, mammals like the meerkats we mentioned earlier, coatis. There's so many, and really people need to think twice before they get an exotic pet. Emma, do your homework. Better still, go to a reputable rescue centre and get a dog or a cat or a small furry animal like a rabbit that have been essentially bred over the years to be companion animals. Snakes, iguanas, meerkats, they are not companion animals. They are wild animals and should be in the wild. So we would like to see better protection for animals. We'll continue to campaign using lobbying for better protection. So we lobby the government, we lobby local authorities, we use undercover investigations, and of course we use various campaigns in the media to get people to think about captive animals and not to support any industry or any event that uses live animals to entertain people.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing about all of your work and all those different types of things that you campaign for. I definitely learned stuff, and so I'm sure many of our listeners have learned as well. So thank you for that. Can you tell us how we could take the first step to get more involved in your cause?
Of course. So Freedom for Animals, of course, is based in the United Kingdom, and we work mostly on UK and European issues, but we do also join coalitions working on global issues like elephants in zoos and so on. So if anybody wants to make a donation to Freedom for Animals, they're more than welcome. You can go to our website, which is www.freedomforanimals.org.uk. But of course, there are some magnificent, wonderful organisations in the US as well. We work very closely with Born Free Foundation here in the UK. And of course, Born Free USA is a very well known organisation. And I know they've got a fantastic monkey sanctuary down in Texas, for example, and other sanctuaries around the country, and do some superb work, particularly on zoos, circuses, and the exotic pet trade. So, perhaps support that organisation or similar organisations, Humane Society and USA and so on. So donations help, but it's more about changing your lifestyle and perhaps influencing other people's lifestyles. So here at Freedom for Animals, we promote and support a vegan lifestyle. We don't want to see any animals harmed for human entertainment or consumption or use. So do think about transitioning to a vegan lifestyle or a more plant-based lifestyle. If you're not able to do that, reducing consumption of meat and dairy is one of the best things you can do for the planet, and we would certainly support that. But if you are a zoo goer, if you do go to zoos, and many people out there do, and we recognise that, just think about what's going on in the background, and maybe look at our website and Born Free USA website and click on the zoo link and just see what some of the problems are with zoos, and then ask them questions. We tend to just go to these places, be entertained and go home again. And one thing, and it comes up in my Facebook feed now regularly, is when a new animal is born in a zoo. There was I think a hippo born recently in Dublin Zoo here in Ireland. But because of the way Facebook works, of course, I get posts from zoos all over the world, and they're always celebrating the birth of a new baby animal. And the reason for that is quite straightforward. It's because it will attract visitors to see the cute baby animal, and I understand that. We all love baby animals. But what they don't tell you, and I've never received a post yet from any zoo telling me that this month they killed a number of surplus animals because they're no use to them for breeding purposes. They don't tell us that. They don't tell us when things go wrong. And I think from an openness and transparency and accountability perspective, they should do. So I would suggest to people that have an open mind. If you go to the zoo, great, but just think about whether that animal is thriving there and whether or not its welfare is being compromised by being there. Think of how much space it would have in the wild compared to what you can see it in there, and perhaps just ask questions and look for alternatives to zoos. Go and look at the wildlife out in your backyard, out in the local national park. Go and do those things outdoors. You might not see an elephant, but you will see other fantastic wildlife. You know, as I mentioned, the birds here in Ireland are fantastic. In America, of course, you've got bears and big cats and other things. And get out and about in the countryside and look at the animals there rather than blaring at them through cages and through bars. So change yourself and change everybody around you to support animals in the wild. And if you're going to make a contribution, instead of going to the zoo, why not work out how much you would spend and donate that to a conservation organization that's working in perhaps a developed country that might not have many resources, so that they can protect and defend their wild animals without having to sell them to the highest bidder.
Yes, great. Thank you for sharing those. Those are all super tangible ways that people can help and change out. And I know that our number one thing we push is definitely vegan diet to help. So
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so it even ties into this topic, which is great.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It made me think when you mentioned just looking out in your old local wildlife. Just a few years back, we live very much in a deserty area, and we looked out the window and there was a bobcat drinking out of our pool.
Yeah.
So even then, we were like, "Oh wow,
Fantastic, yeah, and
yeah,
you'll have so many migratory birds coming through Arizona, the hummingbirds and so on, that you can put up feeders for, and they'll stop off and on the way up north. There's just so much to see. It's just incredible. If you get yourself a bird book and a book about mammals, and off you go with a pair of binoculars and see what you can see.
There you go." Well, thank you so much, Andrew. We really appreciate you spreading your message here with us, and I can't wait to see what your messages inspire in our community. So thank you so
Fantastic.
much.
And if any of your community have any questions or anything they would like to ask me, please do pass on my contact details.